let's now turn to the neoliberal university. From the 1990s onwards, in various countries, education became less seen as a vehicle of national social policy with positive economic side effects under the welfare state. Neoliberal logics have introduced a different philosophical premise to organizing higher education, no longer based on knowledge as a public good. The purpose of neoliberal logic is to create a new social reality of higher education by suggesting it already de facto exists. This makes all alternatives seem impossible, unfeasible, or simply obsolete. As the global north or Western countries transition from industrial and manufacturing capitalism to knowledge capitalism, they are referred to as knowledge-based societies or knowledge-based economies. This is the social construction of a new reality. In so-called knowledge-based economies, knowledge is the vehicle for profit and it dominates global value chains. There is greater emphasis on knowledge production and ownership as overall control of global value chains. Knowledge production becomes understood as synonymous with capital accumulation. Competitiveness between nations in the knowledge economy can be understood as a position in terms of being exploited or being the exploiter. The logic is that in the era of globalization, developed nations compete within global value chains for the work with the highest surplus value possible to be extracted. This entails allowing manufacturing jobs to be outsourced to locations with lower production costs overall, but maintaining also overall control over the entire value chain. According to Moisio and Kangas, the knowledge economy represents, quote, not only the highest form of social organization, but also the most effective system of wealth accumulation. Note, this is not their endorsement of the system, but a critique. Increased need for state competitiveness increases the need for universities to be competitive. This also means higher demands on the competitiveness of academics themselves, also of students. Universities are refashioned as so-called knowledge factories, which are locations of knowledge production and thus value creation. As such, universities are too precious for the national economy in the context of highly competitive global competition to be left to their own devices or to academics themselves. Indeed, they have to be drawn into capital accumulation through academic capitalism, which reprioritizes economic needs above the educating mission of universities. In this context, post-Marxists offer a critique of the logic of or ideology of competitiveness and its consequences. The competitive framing from authoritative transnational and international bodies such as the OECD and the EU through the so-called Bologna process explicitly seek to increase the economic efficiency of higher education and create a more homogeneous higher education market to increase the economic competitiveness of Europe. Other transnational neoliberal so-called disciplining actors include the different ranking systems of higher education that can also influence material conditions through determining funding. Rankings have also introduced positive public relations for marketing as a necessary form of symbolic capital for globally competing universities, again further away from the substance of the universities. The core interest of universities turn to their outputs, innovation for business or industry and graduates for the labor market and little else. To leverage a public good, it is subjected to local, national, global businesses, industry interests and political elite consensus over the intrinsic value of competitiveness. The so-called triple helix model expects higher education to deliver synergy between itself, the state, and businesses and also industry interests. Analysis of the future-oriented higher education policy vision documents in Finland and elsewhere would seem to support this assumption. The emphasis is on education as an economic prerogative. The knowledge economy paradigm has created a spiral of competitiveness that is oppositional to traditional academic work and forms of collegial and community cooperation within the academic community. Inside universities, old systems of collegial democratic governance and decision-making, by contrast, are being perceived as too slow and unreliable to meet the constantly changing circumstances of the free markets. In its stead, centralized and professionalized strategic management of higher education as a nationally important resource, strategic management is considered necessary. Legislative changes are often necessary also to drive through these reforms in the higher education sector. This follows the usual way of neoliberal reforms, meaning the state reorganizes the operational logics of the public sector to open new directions and free space for capital to expand. Administrative and policy reforms impact the entire higher education sector. This is the new inevitable logic of academic capitalism. The reforms always have to be discursively legitimized, however. In the Finnish case, the reforms were discursively represented as something being already almost too late. Finland had perceivedly fallen behind in competition and had to radically catch up, despite research arguing that no such crisis really existed. The everyday crisis of neoliberalization drives and necessitates constant market-oriented reforms. Following Marx's argument, capital is always compelled to reproduce itself, and the competitive compulsion further heightens this anxiety. This anxiety, in turn, is carried down to institutional levels, meaning universities, and individual identities, meaning staff and students. The core problem is losing control over the conditions of academic work and studying, as it is subjected to academic capitalism, its efficiency requirements and output demands. We should note, however, that there are vast differences and considerable variety in neoliberalization of higher education depending on national context. Neoliberalization of higher education has been far more prevalent in the Anglophone countries, meaning the UK, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, than in Finland. In Finland, the University Reform Act of 2009 is exemplified by the first foundation university merger to create a, quote, world-class, competitive, entrepreneurial university that would educate, quote, global engineers in Finland. The entrepreneurial university or innovation university, alternatively, became a typical discursive marker for the new priorities of public universities in Finland. Professor Chris Shore has characterized the new priorities of universities as follows, quote, new funding mechanism and auditing systems designed to render universities more economical, accountable, flexible, and more responsive both to industry and to the government itself, unquote. The government expects universities to fulfill a wide range of strategic roles and functions. The main objective is the creation of high-income, knowledge-based economy. In practice, universities are expected to fulfill their previous missions, civilizing missions, plus prioritize the new economic goals. To ensure the compliance of universities to these new goals, more measures of control are needed to ensure a safe return on public investment. Especially in Finland, making the universities autonomous and thus fully responsible for their own finances has highlighted the importance of strategic management and increasing production output. It has become the new common sense that it is perfectly reasonable for a government to seek to maximize the return on its public investment through improved efficiency and effectiveness in the public sector. As a result, universities are less accountable to their community, staff, and students than to the state. This puts the definition of university autonomy into perspective and redefines academic autonomy. New managerial techniques are also predicated on the reconceptualization or outright erosion of institutional trust. academics who tend to have high intrinsic motivation to self-govern themselves are nonetheless externally managed. To avoid wasting resources, managerialized accountability no longer expects public servants to protect the redefined public good. They have to be guided and surveilled. Brunila and Hannukainen in their article note that the university becomes rife with project-based work, which by default is precarious by nature. This is a natural extension of the project market that fits academic capitalism as a whole. Projects are an inherently market-oriented way of seeing work as something that is done for the duration that it is funded, as opposed to permanent working contracts. This can be seen as the increase of casualized labor even in the relatively privileged realm of academia. Under academic capitalism, academic labor must be controlled. While one might think that academic labor already owns its own means of production, think again. Academic labor is dependent on its affiliation to a university for access to, for example, the university library. This also creates chains of subjugation that heighten a sense of alienation and precarity. The sense of alienation that is expressed by nostalgia of the so-called good old days isn't unique to academia, but a reaction to a broader change in societal relations of power. More accurately, it is a reaction to labor disempowerment. This also applies to students who are increasingly controlled through demands, restrictions, and financial tools such as debt regimes to be productive. Higher education is seen as a personal investment in material wealth rather than a public good or any sort of civilizing goal. Here I would strongly recommend Richard Hall's book, The Alienated Academic, which returns to Marxist critique in the context of post-Marxist academic capitalism. Post-Marxist critique of higher education would argue that rather than trying to return to a nostalgic conceptualization of higher education that was tied to the welfare state, as with the welfare state itself, we must move on to understand the historical and specific circumstances of how capitalism operates. Indeed, it might be necessary to keep an idea of mass intellectuality with an emancipatory goal in mind, but also ask if this can be achieved through the modern university beset by academic capitalism. Now once more, here is an assignment for you. Before taking a break, again to stretch your legs and taking your eyes off the screen, please view this short Marxism in a Minute video by Hadas Thier. The video is based on Hadas Thier's book, People's Guide to Capitalism, and talks about who are the working class under modern capitalism. I think you will find this very instructive.